So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at, again, Locke's essay, Book 4, chapters 1 and 2, 4, and 11. And it's all about knowledge. These are incredibly rich and detailed chapters. So I'm going to give you basically the highlights so you can more or less understand what's going on and how this fits in to Locke's general empiricist program. Now, Locke, of course, states repeatedly throughout the essay, and he does it again here, he says, look, knowledge, as we've seen, is composed of ideas. So he's told the story that ideas are not innate, that they come in basically through the senses, and then also when the mind looks at its own operations, and then you get the ideas of reflection. So we've seen this, simple ideas, complex ideas, where they come from, the sources. But ultimately, remember, the source is experience. And experience is either experience of external stuff or the operations of one's own mind, the faculties, the powers. Now, with this in mind, Locke stresses that, knowledge is composed of ideas, that's made up of them, but it's not merely the having of ideas or simply the believing. Like if you have an idea of cat and you believe that there's a cat out there or something, that's not the same thing as knowledge. So you can, as Locke says, you can fancy ideas, be attracted by them or repulsed by them. You can believe in them or not believe in them. You can entertain, etc., etc. So there's lots of things that the mind does with ideas, but Locke says that's not going to count as knowledge. So what does knowledge mean? Well, it's having ideas, but it's something more. Locke says that knowledge is actually a particular perception of ideas. So it does lean towards this notion that it's an active perception. That's what knowledge is going to be. Not merely just the having ideas, but it's a perception of ideas. Perception of what? Locke says it's the perception of the connection and agreement of ideas or the disagreement, repugnancy of ideas. So it's seeing ideas, as we learned earlier, through one of the powers, the faculties of the mind. Remember that faculty of recollection, which subdivided into two parts, and one was contemplation, the other was memory. Contemplation was the ability of the mind to hold ideas in front of it, right? So before the mind, it could hold a couple ideas and contemplate them, compare them, contrast them. So this idea of this just general approach is that knowledge is really grounded on our perceptions of, shall we say, largely kind of the relations between ideas, not just simply the having of them. Now, this sort of this notion of the connection and agreement, or the disagreement and the repugnancy, I've put in a little box here and put an asterisk by it, because Locke is going to subdivide or split this into 4 levels. In other words, we can notice, perceive connections and agreements in 4 different ways. They're not all exactly watertight separations. Remember, Locke, says things like, well, there's a multitude of ways, and I think we can boil them down to these 4 categories. So always take Locke more or less at his word when he says, I think this is about right, that he's giving rough categorizations of a multitude of operations of the mind. So, simplest one is recognizing identity or diversity, then a little more complicated is relation, then a little bit more, not necessarily more complicated, but another mode, shall we say, of the recognition of connections and agreements and so on, is coexistence, necessary connection, and the last one is real existence. So what's going on here? Well, let's consider the simplest one, namely identity or diversity. And this is something like if you have a proposition like, think about this one. And we're just dealing with some simple recognitions of colors. I have a whiteboard and I have black writing on it. So a very, very simple perception, which is basically an act of knowledge, is going to be, at this level here, white is not black. Okay? That's an arrangement of ideas in a structure, and you can perceive this, and you can simply perceive that white is not black. So what's going on here is we do, in fact, according to Locke, perceive that white is not black. This is a perception, and this perception that we have, that's expressed linguistically here, because you could express it in different languages. Remember, languages have their words, there's an arbitrary connection to the ideas, so you can make all kinds of mistakes with languages or whatnot, but you can't, Locke says, mistake black and white. So this is two things. First off, it's infallible. In other words, again, you can't get this wrong. It's infallible. These are fundamental types of perceptions that we have. Again, even for an empiricist, Locke is saying that there are fundamental perceptions you have of ideas that are infallible. So you can't be wrong. You're not going to make this a mistake on this. You cannot see, the black lettering as the white or the white as the black. You can't make that mistake. Because if you could, basically, you could blend or combine simple ideas. And Locke, remember, says you can't do that. The mind can't create those things. It can move them around. It can compare them and all. But it can't destroy one or shall we say, blend one into the other. You can't do that. So they're infallible. And the other one is that they are... And we'll see a lot of stuff about direct and indirect knowledge. But something like white is not black is direct knowledge. In other words, if you were to say, how do I know this? Just by direct perception. You don't need an argument. In other words, there's not some train of reasoning that leads to the conclusion, white is not black. You could make that up if you wanted, I suppose. But Locke would say you don't need it. It's not really necessary to do it. You can see right away white is not black. And it's not really that any argument could make you more convinced that white is not black. So you couldn't say, well, I was a little bit unsure about white is not black, but someone came up with this argument, and then it really led me to be totally convinced that white is not black. Locke says that's basically absurd. So this is an instance of an infallible and direct perception that Locke would say is knowledge. Interesting. That's an empiricist saying this. So this is at a very basic level that we perceive that an idea is what it is and not another idea. Remember, we've seen this stuff about Locke's talked about this in the manipulations of ideas back in book 2. Book 2. Locke's talked about this, but here he's laying it out in terms of knowledge or diversity, that two ideas are different, like black and white, different. So, blue is not green. So these basic, very standard, direct observation statements, you might want to call them. In a sense, this direct observation of our ideas lead us to these infallible statements. So in this sense, Locke has a foundationalist approach to his epistemology, which puts him in a similar camp in that sense to Descartes. So it's not the case that Locke says, oh no, all observations are up for grabs. I'm an empiricist, they could be wrong. No, not this. It's never going to be the case that tomorrow you're going to say, actually, white is black. That's not going to happen. So in this sense, there are these almost as close to a priori propositions, but certainly not innate. Now, the next level up is relation. And in that sense, if all we could do is distinguish ideas from each other, white is not black, we would be pretty limited in our knowledge. Like, that all you'd be able to do is make distinctions, right? White is not black, green is not yellow, stuff like that. Round is not square, things like that. You can't confuse the idea of round and the idea of square with each other. So that wouldn't be too much of knowledge. We'd be pretty limited, right? We wouldn't have science and all the stuff that we do. So what's going on? You need something more complex here. And Locke thinks that we can go in a high level and we can look at more relations between ideas. And so here we get the level of like mathematical arguments. So this is how you can get relations between ideas. So like the three internal angles of a triangle. So you can see it's getting a lot more complicated. The three internal angles of the triangle equal to right angles. So there's a lot of relationships between ideas. I mean, that's just ultimately a simple geometric theorem, but you know, the three internal angles, you sum them up, you get 180 degrees. A right angle is 90, double it, you get 180. So the relationships are all there. And this kind of knowledge is, again, what we can just see through these acts of the mind. So it's a little bit of a level up, a little more complicated than just simply identity and disagreement. But now we're talking about the connection and agreement, right? So now we got a more complex notion of connection and agreement through relation. So he's going to go up a couple notches. Coexistence, necessary connection. What's he talking about with that? Well, think about you have an idea, complex idea of gold. It's got malleability, you know, maybe coolness to the touch, so a sense of temperature, color, etc., etc. You analyze it out into its more simple ideas, and so as we've seen, simple ideas, they sum up, you get a complex idea. But if you put gold into a fire, it melts it, but those properties, so what we talked about, the malleability and all that, that basically remains. And so you notice the coexistence of these simple ideas in your complex idea of gold. So this nature of coexistence, and then in your experience you will notice things that always go together. So you notice these things as having necessary connections. So again, this is based on your experience and involves more complex ideas. So we're just going up levels, getting more and more complex. With the notion of real existence, number 4 in our little chart, this is beyond simple coexistence, beyond even coexistence in either accidental or necessary coexistence, but this is asserting that something corresponds to the idea. So you have the idea and you know somehow that it has an ontological or a real world correlate. You may not know that in other things. So what Locke is trying to do is avoid the charge that all of his discussion just leads so far here just to a play of ideas in the mind, that the mind's just recognizing all these things. And all these ideas could just be fictions. That is, they have no connection to the real world. Locke wants to avoid that because that throws him down the line of some kind of idealist skepticism, or at worst, it could force him into a position like solipsism, where reality is just my mind and all the ideas are in it, and I notice a bunch of connections, but there's nothing outside of it that's real, not even you or anything. It's just me and my ideas. A ridiculous position. No philosopher has held it. That's always, a caricature if you think a philosopher has held that. No philosopher has held that kind of strong solipsistic view. But Locke certainly doesn't want the apparatus, the machinery, to force him into embracing that view. So he brings in number 4 with this thing about that something corresponds to the idea, this notion of existence. And that real existence clearly applies, Locke says, to the idea of God. This is reminiscent of an old medieval argument. And kind of, if you've done a little bit of medieval philosophy, Anselm said that there were certain kinds of ideas that had necessary existence attached to them. He didn't really use the language of ideas, but for our purposes here, he thought that there was something that just couldn't be just a free-floating property. It had a necessity attached to it and a necessary existence. Locke seems to be going down that way too. And so in this sense, some ideas like God, they correspond, you can't help but thinking them as having existence attached to them. So this notion here of a real existence helps anchor the system of ideas to the world. Locke will talk a little bit more about ideas necessarily corresponding to things in the world a little bit later, and I'll talk about that in a bit in this video. So Locke's got a big difference. You can see he's moving away from the standard model of epistemology, the standard model of knowledge, because now we're talking about levels and things like differences and how different ideas are relating to each other. You don't find that not to this degree and in this manner in Plato. We certainly didn't see anything like this in the Theaetetus. Now we're going to even move further away from the Theaetetus, because Locke is going to start talking about knowledge as direct, habitual, even coming in degrees. So that's like a big break with the Greek notion of knowledge, which was basically totally, when you have knowledge, it's infallible. Well, Locke's got a little bit about that up here. And it's also direct. Yeah, Locke has that, but he expands it much more than Plato or Socrates ever talked about, especially with the idea of degrees of knowledge. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on, as I mentioned, in these chapters. But Locke talks about various kinds of direct knowledge. Well, that's when we see something, perceiving. That's at the level of when you perceive it directly, like this. White is not black. You're perceiving something, as I mentioned, direct. Habitual is going to involve memory. So something that you've learned, some knowledge that you've had, an experience of knowledge, some kind of perception, or maybe a mathematical proof that you've learned something, you know it, if you have what we could say a piece of knowledge, gets embedded in your storehouse, and you call it up later. That could be habitual knowledge that you use from time to time because of the needs of life. You tuck it away in storage, bring it out when you need it. And it could also be mathematical knowledge. It could be knowledge also that you've forgotten. All of the steps in the proof towards the conclusion, but you remember the conclusion. Locke still allows that to be classified as knowledge. Otherwise, if you forget, it would be kind of odd if you went through a mathematical proof, you learned it, and then you forgot some of the steps in the proof. We would say, oh, you don't have knowledge of that conclusion anymore. That seems to be a counterintuitive notion. Locke wants to say, yeah, you still have knowledge of that conclusion. So Locke's then got a whole notion of knowledge being a larger category. It's not really a species anymore. Think of it more like a genus. There are different kinds of knowledge. So the highest degree is going to be intuitive knowledge. Again, this is like that direct knowledge, intuitive knowledge. When you have to bring in demonstrations and all these other aspects, like in mathematics, well, now you're moving into demonstrative knowledge. So again, Locke is opening up this category of knowledge, breaking it open, and there are various species of knowledge. So knowledge, in the capital sense, think of this as a genus, like animal, and then there's elephants and horses and whatnot. So there's different species. So think of it like that, and you are well on your way to seeing how Locke's understanding of all this stuff differs quite a bit from the traditional Greek understanding. All right, so now anything that's going to fall outside, though, so when you look at this, anything that we claim, quote unquote, to know, but it doesn't fall into these degrees, Locke is going to say, well, outside of this is faith and opinion. So in that sense, he's a lot like Plato in the Greeks too, had this notion of knowledge is a certain special category, and then outside of that, you're in things like opinion or mere belief, or as Locke says, faith. And he's not denigrating that. He's saying it's very important to know where you are, where your claims are, where they lie, whether they're direct, habitual, what degree of knowledge they are, or maybe they're not knowledge at all. Maybe they're just matters of faith or matters of opinion. We're going to look a little later at Locke on faith and opinion when we look at notions of reason and religion in Locke. And again, he doesn't just put everything to do with religion in terms of faith or mere opinion, because as we've seen, he does think that real existence attaches to the idea of God, and he does think that you can rationally demonstrate the existence of God. And certainly God has played a big role, because Locke thinks our bodies and all that are basically they're products of God's work. And God has made it so that, our knowledge even is good enough for our purposes. So, right, we shouldn't, we should always light candles and not just sit and curse the darkness. Now, Locke, again, returns to this notion where he's continually worried about the charge that his system ultimately leads to. It's just a mind playing with ideas, again, into that solipsism charge that I talked about earlier. He's worried about that. That's a common thing of the time, that you can just lapse into this, and it's endemic whenever you start with the notion that the mind is only confronting its ideas and not necessarily having direct contact with the world. There's a lot of debate over how to read Locke on ideas, but simple, straightforward reading is that Locke does have this challenge, that the mind is with ideas and there's an external world. How do you more or less bridge that gap? So how do we know which of our ideas really have these external ontological correlates? And Locke says that simple ideas, they really can't be produced by the mind, so they got to be produced by the world. But there's some tension in here, because simple ideas include colors, and colors we saw, had problems with being, secondary qualities, which are ultimately made up of primary qualities. And so you had that whole mess that we talked about with the primary secondary ideas distinction, and then the primary secondary qualities distinction in the object. But ultimately, when Locke is pressed, sometimes he says, well, it's kind of like science to make sure that these simple ideas work. Sometimes he talks, and here he talks more like that God has ensured that this all fits together, that our minds are so constituted in a way that the simple ideas do provide a reliable bridge to the external world. And so we can say, yeah, we're not caught in a solipsistic prison, that indeed our ideas are reflective of what's going on outside, and we're not just trapped in our mind. But Locke, if you read him carefully, does suggest that there's never a completely clean and accurate and perfect representation of the external world by our ideas. He says that, but the resemblance, look, it's good enough. It's going to be good enough for real knowledge. If you really want to go absolutely strictly for the perfect representation, Locke seems to just suggest you just can't. You can't know that. You can't have that. And it may not be the most satisfactory answer in the world, but if you read the history of philosophy, especially post-Descartes, but especially once you start digging into the British empiricists and ending up with Hume and even Kant, that question of the primary interface of the mind and the world, or idea and object, or idea and quality, that one, Hume writes it off. He said how the impressions arise in the soul, I'm not going there, I don't know. Even Kant, after the benefit of reading all this British empiricism, reading Leibniz, who I haven't talked about, but Leibniz is another strain of rationalism, and trying to put all this together, Kant too does not explain exactly how that fundamental interface works, beyond just saying that the mind is so constituted in a certain way that the incoming data is organized in a way that we can make sense of and construct an experience. But to say what exactly is going on outside of the mind, he calls that the ding en sich, where it's the thing in itself, it's unknowable in principle. So this fundamental interface is a long problem in the history of philosophy, and it's basically engendered as a result of certain things with the scientific revolution, once the old Greek notion of epistemology was broken, that the mind had somehow some insight into the forms of objects. That is gone, and even Descartes has to struggle with this as well. He has this sort of Platonic insight into the essence of materials. That's gone in Locke. So you get this kind of difficulty and ultimately a kind of skepticism as what this primary interface is. All right, so that's just a basic discussion of Locke's much richer and much deeper discussion. I just want to make a few more points now onto chapter 11. Locke says that we have an intuitive knowledge of a few things, right? We have this intuitive knowledge of ourselves, and so almost like a Descartes, like a Cartesian cogito, and of God's existence. But existence of other things comes through sensation, and this necessary link of an existence of an idea of the notion of existence and ideas only works in certain contexts, not them all. And Locke says that our certainty here about other things, like external things in the world, does not reach the level of the certainty that we have regarding the existence of ourselves and the existence of God. So in that way, again, he's a lot like Descartes. But unlike Descartes, Locke says, oh, come on. If you, and here Hume echoes this as well. Locke says, there's good reason for thinking that there are external things and that our ideas are caused by them. He says, close your mind. He gives a number of examples. I'll give you a couple here. He says, close your eyes. In the dark, if you close your eyes, so you're in real darkness, you can use your storehouse, you can use your memory, you can use your recollection, dig up a whole bunch of stuff. You can imagine all kinds of things. You can imagine seeing the sun, right? You've been out on a summer day, you call that up from memory. And if you do that when you're in the dark room, you get a certain kind of image of the sun in your mind. Fine. And you can remove it. You can bring in then an image of an ice cream cone, etc., etc. So you have all kinds of freedom with those ideas in a certain context. But if you walk outside, you don't have that kind of freedom anymore with the sun as it's shining down on you. Locke says you don't have a choice. You can't just simply will that away. And many times in our lives, you can't just will ideas away like you can with your imagination. So there's got to be some fundamental difference. Same thing like I talked earlier about remembering the ice cream cone and actually eating an ice cream cone. How do we make that distinction without presupposing the external world in the first place, which begs the question. Locke says they just feel different. It's a different experience to imagine eating an ice cream cone and to eat the ice cream cone, or to recall eating an ice cream cone, and we don't confuse these things. And if someone does confuse these things, we tend to say that something's gone wrong. So in that sense, Locke says that the external world, it's an old sort of argument, the external world shoves you around. You don't have that much freedom when you go out and walk around. You're bombarded and your mind is getting all kinds of ideas. You don't have the freedom to just let them come and go. You have to isolate yourself and then use your imagination. You've got freedom there, but that's not normally the case. Second thing, Locke makes an interesting observation, and I'll end on this, regarding the stability of external objects over time. He says, yeah, of course, you see an external object. Here's an external object. I pass it behind my hand. and then I move it out on the other side. Now, what happened when it went behind my hand? I can see what's going on. You can't. Locke says you could, if you wanted to go really hardcore, you could say, what's the proof that this is the same as this? Right? Where is the proof that when it went behind my hand, that it didn't change into a different pen or something, or something funny that violates your notion of continuity? Well, Locke says, you probably can't prove that. You can't absolutely prove continuity. And in this way, he more or less anticipates where Hume will say it's a kind of fiction. But Locke says that's an unreasonable request to absolutely demand a proof that when your friend walks out of the room and then walks back in 2 minutes later, and I don't know, she's carrying a cup of coffee or something, that no, it's actually you can't absolutely prove that the same person that left and it's the same person that walks in with a cup of coffee. You can't absolutely prove that. But Locke says, if you then say, well, I'm going to be a skeptic now, I'm going to doubt or seriously doubt that it is the same person who left and got the cup of coffee, I'm going to doubt that, then Locke says, well, you know, there's no real rational grounds for doubting this at all. So it's not rational to go and push doubt to its absolute extreme. That's an implicit charge against Descartes. So we can't be absolutely certain about the existence of external objects, fine. We can't be absolutely certain about the continuity of the existence of external objects, fine. But Locke still thinks that yes, you can be certain of the external existence and continuity of God. So it's an odd sort of thing. You wouldn't have expected this with an empiricist, but it shows how Locke's philosophy still contains a lot of religious elements. Makes it a little bit more complex, a little more interesting, but also a little bit more difficult. So that wraps up the notion of knowledge. As I said, we still got to talk a little bit about this and a little bit about reason. But that's a story for another time. Stay tuned.